Welcome to my Humankind early modern era tier list, comparing the greats and the not so greats in this very average era. Please do leave a like rating if you enjoy. I'll have gameplay of every culture throughout and the tier list rankings. First and foremost, it's the Dutch. The Dutch are one of two money-focused cultures in the era, the other being the final Venetians. Their trait provides +1 money per population on all cities. A nice little buff. Immediately, you're probably getting about 20 gold on each city. Maybe you can net 80 gold or something from this per turn. Wonderful. Their emblematic quarter, on the other hand, is the complete opposite of wonderful. The VOC warehouse is frustrating because it has potential to be really good. There's one thing that lets it down. You might look at it and think +20 money per adjacent harbour is fantastic. The downside is you can't place this district anywhere. It is fixed to being placed adjacent to existing districts. What that means is you can't build it off your harbours. So unless you happen to have spots near your harbour, free and available to build on, you're not going to get the +20. It's not impossible, but it's difficult, and it really lets the Dutch down. Otherwise, there are some nice enough bonuses. Traders within your city will receive 2 extra money each, and you'll have an extra slot. Overall, this district has potential to be great, but the fact that you can't place it anywhere honestly makes it god-awful, and you'll see that in the footage on screen. Lastly, their emblematic unit. The Vliet is a Dutch ship. It replaces your naval transports, okay? So you can't actually build this thing. It just replaces what happens to your units when they go into the ocean. In this case, they received a ranged combat buff, must have line of sight. It replaces land units as they embark across ocean tiles, and you'll get a little bit of extra movement as well, which can be really useful when starting your turn in allied territories. Of course, don't forget as we go through this, that in general, naval units and buffs tend to be less useful in Humankind and actually in every other 4X game as well. Here's looking at you, Civilization 6. The point here is when we bring the Dutch picture together, unfortunately it paints one I'm not super hot on. The +1 money over population is a great trait, and it's useful for the rest of the game, okay? Powerful, also synergizes with food cultures a little bit too. The warehouse is nothing to write home about, one of the worst districts in the era, if not the worst, and their emblematic unit, while having some versatility, isn't actually that good because of all the other fairly decent melee units in this era. Most of them are carrying guns. It is for that reason that I give the Dutch a fairly scathing review. At the moment, I'm going to place them at a C tier, but do bear in mind this is a low C tier, and as with all my other tier list videos, we'll reflect on it at the end, just to make sure everything is placed right. Next up in the order that the game presents the cultures to us are the ever wonderful Haudenosaunee. These guys are fairly powerful, one of 2 agrarian cultures since we have the addition of Maasai, the Cultures of Africa DLC. What do they give us? Well, trait, land of plenty, +1 food on exploitations. A reminder here going through that exploitations aren't just districts, but also generally the tiles nearby that they're exploiting to get resources out of. You'll see that throughout the video. +1 food, pretty good. Pretty decent. Also, of course, because it buffs their emblematic quarter, the Three Sisters Plantation. A wonderful district that provides +5 food per number of attached territories, so there is a small caveat there on ensuring it can grow and scale well. You do need to have a couple of attached territories. On most of your cities, you should have 1 or 2 anyway. +3 food per adjacent farmer's quarter makes this thing a little powerhouse, and it provides an extra farmer's slot. It's a pretty straightforward foodie district that does benefit slightly empires that have more territories attached, although the +1 food from exploitation trait generally makes it fairly useful overall. Their emblematic unit is actually one of note. This unit is a gunner. It's a ranged combat unit therefore, but it's also a stealth unit. It can only be seen by adjacent units, and it can either enter under other empires' territories without an open borders treaty. As a non-expansionist culture, that's also a slight bonus. Not enough, of course, to write home about. And as far as I'm concerned, the Haudenosaunee are a powerful culture. One that you could absolutely pick. They're an agrarian with a good unit. They're a solid choice. In this case, I'm going to place them at a high B tier. And again, as I say, if we need to make any adjustments as we go through, we can come back at the end. But I'm fairly confident at ranking them fairly middle of the road. Sometimes I think maybe they deserve an A because of their food and their wonderful synergies, but I'm going to place them at a B, and it really is smack down the middle, average culture for me. Joseon is up next, and unlike the Haudenosaunee before, where there are now actually 2 food cultures in the era thanks to the addition of the DLC, Joseon is alone in being the only scientific culture in this wonderful era. Their trait provides +3 science on tiles producing science, so it's a nice little effect that's being added onto everything you already have, and of course will continue to be added in future. Don't forget this can include everything from random tiles to strategic resources as well. Their emblematic quarter, the Serwan, is a powerhouse of a scientific district, again, the only one of its kind in this era as well. It provides a generic +2 influence, which is a handy little bonus, but really you're here for science, which you'll get the same, +2. You'll also receive +3 science per adjacent research quarter, and the classic +1 science on your researchers and an extra slot for researchers on your cities. This district is very powerful because don't forget the trait is also being added onto all of the adjacent research quarters as well. This thing is not so hot by itself, but once you grab a couple of nerds to build next to it, you'll feel really comfortable and at home with the science generation here. The emblematic unit, unfortunately, is not as versatile. Again, it's a naval unit, and don't forget, in this era, just like any other, really, naval units tend to be just slightly less useful. Okay, not always, don't get me wrong. I actually love a good naval gameplay. Regular viewers of the live streams will know that. But, in general, not quite as useful. This one in particular is also very difficult to build because of its strategic resource requirements. However, if you can manage to build it, it is a powerhouse. It's a gunner platform, of course, and it's a ramming boat. Increased movement speed in battle and +5 combat strength versus adjacent targets. If you can pull together the resources required to build this and get the technologies, etc. online before it becomes redundant, which can be difficult to do, this is a powerhouse of a unit. Again, though, all of those caveats really do stack against it and make it a bit weaker than it could otherwise be. Overall, though, Joseon's a very powerful pick in the era because it's the only scientist culture in the era that further makes it even stronger. Don't forget, scientists can research through into the next era. It is for these reasons combined and the fairly strong, versatile nature of Joseon that allows me to rank them at a high A tier, or should I say maybe a middle of the road A tier. Let's not oversell them too much. Next up we have Maasai, the second food culture in the era, and therefore in many cases a direct competitor to the Haudenosaunee who we've already looked at. So, what do the Maasai do? Added of course is the Cultures of Africa DLC. Well, to be honest, they're probably the most plain Jane of all of the cultures added. They're basic, much like how religion is implemented or managed by the player in Humankind. Yet, as I always argue, basic isn't bad, and in this case I think that Maasai is actually fairly good. Their trait is, again, quite straightforward. -25% population consumption on all cities. Your people will eat 25% less, or indeed you'll consume 25% less population. Their emblematic quarter, again, is fairly useful. +5 food per adjacent exploitation. Don't forget this is slightly more flexible than things that require districts, because often this counts just generic tiles that the district will be exploiting. And this district can be placed anywhere. It doesn't need to be placed adjacent to others, just like a garrison, and in fact most of the districts that were added in the Cultures of Africa DLC, this bad boy is flexible, and don't underestimate that. You'll see it in the gameplay. The very same feature that makes the Dutch district awful, say that 5 times fast, makes this one fantastic. It's a great way to generically add food to all of your cities very quickly and easily. And finally, their emblematic unit, the Maasai Moran, not a moron. This wielding, vicious, club-throwing unit is a really fascinating one. It's a ranged unit with no resource requirements whatsoever. At a fairly cheap industry cost, it's a powerhouse, honestly. It is, of course, less effective when it can't see its target. It receives a -8 combat strength penalty for close combat fights, just like any other ranged unit. But, unlike others, this one, you get a bonus combat strength against already damaged targets. Don't forget that already damaged targets will be dealing less damage to you as well. You can kind of get a double whammy here, where this thing can ranged fire, lob rocks at weak units, and really take them out quickly, and again, you can build it very easily. No prerequisites at all. It is for that reason that Maasai are a fairly flexible culture. The most flexible in the era, I would say. Almost no preconditions on what you can build, on where you can build it, and their trait is always useful because you're always going to have populations in cities consuming things. Well, almost always anyway. I think the Maasai are better than people give them credit for that reason. Yes, they're basic, but they're a food culture, and they do everything right. I believe that the Maasai are therefore much better than the Haudenosaunee because they're not limited to some of the prerequisites like attaching territories that the Haudenosaunee require. It is for that reason that I actually, and you're probably going to flame me for this in the comments, please do post your feedback below. I love to read it, even though on these tier list videos it can be a little rude at times. I'm going to place the Maasai at a low, but still in there, believe it or not, an A tier for the time being. But again, I can't stress enough how low this is, okay? The Maasai are at a really difficult point where they're just nearly there, but not quite enough. They're right on the border of A and B for me. I don't have an emblem for them, so we're just going to pretend like they're the English. And we're going to pretend like they're the English. Okay. Next up, we have Ming. Ming. Okay. So, their trait gives you a 25% discount on enacting future civics and revoking them. Nice to have. Not the only way to get this discount, though, of course. There are other ways to get it, like within religion. You also receive +1 influence on territory. This is almost nothing. Their emblematic quarter, the Grand Tea House, provides influence per districts and per adjacent districts. 1 and 2 in the latter case. And it provides 10 stability, so it cancels out its negative stability and allows you to essentially build one other district at no stability cost. Okay. Fairly straightforward, good bonus to the trait, and a fairly strong district if influence is what you need. As we move through the game, influence becomes arguably less useful. Important to bear that in mind. I will be factoring that in. Their emblematic unit, the rocket car, is probably the most interesting thing about Ming. It's a heavy weapon, and it has the suppressive ability. A target cannot move the next turn, and they have reduced combat strength. This thing nukes units into the ground, but it's a glass cannon. What do I mean by that? I mean it packs a punch, but it's incredibly fragile. It's a heavy weapon, ranged combat. It must have line of sight. It can only move and attack in a turn, or attack. You can do one, not both, okay? It's fragile. It cannot retaliate when it's attacked by a close combat unit. So if something runs up to it and stabs it, it won't fire back. Another thing that makes it quite fragile. Overall, this rocket car is very powerful, particularly, of course, at destroying and suppressing firepower at the enemy, but it's very weak, so you'll need to have it defended, okay? It's a fragile glass cannon, but a fairly powerful one at that. I struggle to rate Ming because they do what they do very well. 25% discount on civics, very powerful. Their Grand Tea House doesn't provide any industry, food, or science, which can really limit your growth in terms of normal FIMs, but it does provide a good amount of influence. So again, what it does well, it does very well. It's fairly easy to use and place, better than the Dutch district, but not as versatile as something like Maasai. It is for that reason that I'm fairly critical of Ming and of the usefulness of Ming. I'm going to rank Ming at a B tier. I think that's roughly where they belong, because while they do produce a good amount of resources and their unit is strong and their trait is always useful, they just don't really pack the punch or the versatility of providing, say, industry, food, or science more useful resources that other cultures deliver. Next up, we have the Mughals. These non-magical people are the only industrial culture in the era. That's a big win for them. What else do they do? Well, you'll receive, for the rest of the game on their trait, plus 2% industry per number of territories in your sphere of influence. Interesting. And actually, a bonus that can stack up pretty well. This is powerful if, of course, you have sphere of influence under your control. Bonus is also only applied on the capital. Next up, we have the emblematic quarter. Again, another really powerful bad boy. It provides 2 influence and 3 industry by default, which is wonderful at the normal stability penalty. What it does uniquely, though, is gives all of your industrial workers +3 industry. +3 industry per worker is actually how it's calculated. And you'll receive an additional +3 industry per adjacent maker's quarter. This district is a powerhouse. You'll see it in the footage. Combine it with a few extra districts, and you're really away laughing. It's a great way to surge your industry, and as the only industrial culture in this era, it's the only way to use that wonderful cultural trait as well to convert all of your money and science into industry. Do bear that in mind. And as if they need anything else to add to their power, they have a tank in the form of an elephant with a giant gun strapped onto its back. The emblematic unit, the Gajnal, is a gunner elephant, and what a fantastic one it is. It's a ranged combat gunner unit like most, and it can move and fire. It has a really impressive combat strength at 45, and the classic tank move 6 and 4 on its movement and its range. It's a fast, powerful move and fire unit, useful to defend and attack. Can also, of course, defend your coastlines from naval invaders. This thing is an absolute powerhouse. It really isn't difficult for me to rank the Mughals at an S tier in this era. Probably an always pick and a spiritual successor to the Khmer that they replace, as far as I'm concerned. Next, we have the Ottomans, one of 2 expansionist cultures in this era. Unfortunately, not a unique selling point for them. However, expansionist cultures have improved a little bit as humankind changes. Their trait gives you a minus 50% production cost, industry cost, on heavy weapons. That's great. Pretty specialized. For a relatively niche weapon class as well, it's important to note. Although, of course, does synergize with what you do. They also receive +3 combat strength on heavy weapons for the rest of the game. A nice benefit, although as we move through the game, +3 begins to be outclassed by the likes of +5 or +7 that you can unlock from events, the tech tree, so on and so forth. Their emblematic quarter is unfortunately a bit of a weak spot. As we move through the game, this era is maybe the last era where you have a reasonable chance to take control of a religion without fighting for it. Their district provides +1 faith per district, so it can scale off existing districts. Difficult to make it scale once you get to a certain point though, because stability will just destroy you. +3 influence and +3 influence per adjacent district. Nice to have. Not incredible though. Again, faith, influence. These are yields that become less useful over time. Their marginal utility is really in decline as we move through the eras. Maybe the emblematic unit has something for us then. Spoiler alert, it somewhat does. Their emblematic unit is another gunner unit. Welcome to the era of guns. This one though is a siege mastery, +3 combat strength when it's participating in an assault or sortie. Interesting. Note you have to be the attacker or a sortie, so you're coming out to defend against the siege to get that bonus. A little niche. The whole thing is a little niche. The fact that this unit isn't a heavy weapon is also a bit odd. Lack of synergy, poor yields, not unique. Question is, are they worse than the Dutch? I think the answer is no. But you know what? I think they both deserve a D ranking. I'm going to rank them above the Dutch, but they're just not very good. There's a real lack of synergy. No real useful yields, or at least no, shall we say, A-grade yields, right? Industry and maybe science are our 2 preferred. At least industry and food, anyway. No synergy, lackluster district, weird traits that don't combine. It's hard for me to recommend this at all. The Ottomans, I'm afraid, you're a D tier. Get out of here. Next up, we have the Poles. The, get this, only unique militarist culture in this wonderful era. What do? Well, their trait gives +10 fortification on districts and +2 stability on districts. A nice way to build up your defensive bonuses and stability, although of course, nothing to write home about here. Their emblematic quarter adds to this a bit more as well. You can place it where you like. It's a fortification, right? It is a garrison. Provides 3 combat strength to units in or adjacent, 8 stability and 2 influence. Again, this thing's not great, okay? It is just not great. It's a slightly over-glorified garrison. Their emblematic unit, the Winged Hussar, oh man. Historically, a really great unit in strategy games, and actually in this case it doesn't disappoint. The Winged Hussar is a heavy cavalry unit, a somewhat rarer unit class. It's fast, it's hard-hitting, it receives +3 combat strength of attacking non-adjacent enemies. It can't climb fortifications though, of course, don't forget. As a charge master though, when it charges at enemies, they can't retaliate. Somewhat useful against certain enemy classes. It's a powerful unit, but again, can't climb walls. +3 combat strength is nice, nothing to write home about. It's another really weak culture here in the Poles, following from the Ottomans. And in fact, I've heard from players who haven't played as much Humankind as maybe you or I, that they tend to get this culture, the Ottomans before and the Spanish after, confused because they're all roughly the same strength and kind of do the same things. Really, the Poles are nothing to write home about except for their good unit. Their stability buffs are nice. On District is also a good bonus because it's slightly more scalable than the others, but really, this is not a culture I would choose. They are the only militarists though, and with that there is some considerations like the Iron Reserves ability that can be incredibly useful to explore the map, to fight enemies if you don't have any troops nearby, or transfer populations. They do therefore have some versatility, and it's important to note that their trait and their emblematic district does, like I say, provide a pinch of value. It is for that reason that I'm actually not going to slam them in D tier like the rest. I'm going to place the Poles at a C tier ranking. I wouldn't usually choose them over Ming, Haudenosaunee. I don't think they're that useful or versatile, but they do have some powerful use cases in certain scenarios that could save the day. I'm placing the Poles at a C tier. Another culture enters the fray with fairly average yields and a gunner unit to mix. No, I'm not repeating the same thing from the last two. This is the Spanish. The Spanish are, in this wonderful era, another expansionist culture, one of two going alongside the Ottomans. So how do they compare? Well, their trait provides 3 combat strength to units starting their turn in non-allied territory. Useful, of course, if you're expansionizing, which is what they do as an expansionist culture. Their emblematic quarter is a cathedral, providing you with a whomping amount of faith and not a lot else. Again, is faith useful in this point in the game? Well, if it's going to be useful, I think it's going to be useful with the Spanish. If you're not winning the faith game at this point, you're probably going to need to go and fight for it. The Spanish allow you to do that while building up your faith at home with +1 faith per population on the cathedral, and an additional 3 faith per any adjacent district. Their conquistadors do add to this synergy as well. Again, a ranged unit with a gun. Go figure. What do they do specifically? They have the El Dorado promotion, which generates additional money from winning battles and ransacking. Spoiler alert, it's double, which is pretty decent. There is some synergy here then, right? You can see it. Extra combat strength for being in enemy territory, non-allied territory. You're an expansionist, and you have a gunner unit that really likes to ransack territories and win battles. It's a shame that the emblematic quarter only provides faith. And I get it. Faith is big in what they do. And if it just provided something else, or even counted as another quarter or something, I would be more willing to rank the Spanish higher. One thing that I can say for sure is that if you're after an expansionist culture in this era, the Spanish are probably the pick. Probably. Although again, if you don't have a faith, if you don't have a religion under your control, it's hard to choose a culture that only provides faith to you from their emblematic district. And if you're not expansionizing, you don't get any value from them. They are therefore, unfortunately, while quite specialized, quite niche. You can usually get value out of their trait and unit in most cases, though. The emblematic quarter could let you down if you're not producing faith, and that's a big limiting factor on them. It is for that reason that I place the Spanish at a low C tier alongside the Poles. I think they could be slightly more useful than the Poles in most cases, but their specialization, while their strength, is unfortunately also their weakness. This could be the one that I get in the most trouble for. Bear with me. The Venetians are a money culture, one of two alongside the Dutch, and we know how good they are. The Venetians' trait, Silver Tongues, gives you +1 money per number of trade routes on cities or outposts, and +2 money for naval trade routes. Again, per number of naval trade route on city or outpost. Nice if you're trading. If you're not so hot. Although, to be fair, in most games, you should be trading with at least a couple of players. It's unlikely you're going to be at war with every single person, so I'm going to assume that this trait is always valuable and scalable if you choose. Their emblematic quarter is undoubtedly better than the Dutch, although when you first build it, it doesn't provide a lot. This thing scales somewhat well, but by itself, pretty bad. It provides +4 influence and +1 influence per adjacent market quarter. Pretty specialized, and again, influence, yeah, it is what it is. It provides also, though, +1 money by itself and on tiles producing money. This is the key that separates it from basically any other district in Era and most others in the game. Instead of providing +1 money per adjacent market quarter or something like that, it provides +1 money on tile producing money. It's a scalable effect, it doesn't need to be adjacent, and it applies across the board, whether it's your harbours earning you money, strategic resources, or your market quarters. Therefore, it is, while not outstanding at only +1, more versatile, and on average and in balance will probably provide you more yields than a much more specialised district could. The scalability of this thing really, I think, sets it apart as well, because it will continue to scale as you scale through future eras. Likewise, their trait will really build on your trade base. It's a shame then that their emblematic unit is a galleass, although in fitting with Venice's theme, it's a powerful one. It's a gunner platform with higher combat strength, get this, +11 in coastal waters. A powerful unit, a specialised unit, and unfortunately a pretty expensive one to produce. You might not be building a lot and you might not be able to find a lot of value out of it, but if you do, I can guarantee you it's worth doing. The unit therefore lets them down a little bit because of its specialization, being a naval unit, blah blah blah. Their trait, while focused on trade, is quite good, and their emblematic quarter takes a long time or potentially a little while to scale up, but once it scales up, it can potentially keep scaling for the rest of the game. I think Venice are a better pick than the Dutch in almost all cases. They take a little while to start to scale up, and they do have a bit of a reliance on trade, so warfaring players of course won't go as well. However, the flip side to that is if you choose a militarist culture, you're better at war but worse at trade, right? So at the end of the day, I don't discount too much from them for that. I think the Venetians are actually way stronger than what most people rank them as. I've seen people rank them at C or D tier, and I completely disagree. I think Venice are a solid A or B tier culture in humankind. I'm slightly reluctant to put them at A, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to rank Venice an A tier culture. And for whatever reason, last and potentially least, we have the Edo Japanese. The Edo Japanese, I don't particularly rate them. Let's find out why. Their trait, Shogun's Authority, provides +1 influence per population. Nice. Again, influence, is it scalable? Well, because we can buy wonders and civics with it, it's better than faith on balance. So yes, it does have some use case. Would I rather industry instead of it though? Absolutely. Their emblematic quarter, the Terra, provides 3 faith, 2 influence by default at a cost of 10 stability. It also provides +5 influence per adjacent mountain. Probably one of the worst adjacency bonuses in the era. The only one as bad as this is the Dutch, requiring a harbour to be nearby, although at least with the harbours you can actually build them. Good luck building a mountain. And at +5, it's not really even worth going for it. It really isn't. This is a bad district. If it provided stability instead of taking it away, it could be a little better. But the way it stands right now, not so hot. Really not so hot. The Joe from the ancient era, absolutely shite on this thing. Then we have the emblematic quarter, the Naginata Samurai. Again, this is a really interesting one. It doesn't have a gun like most other units in the era. It's a close combat anti-cavalry unit that gets +5 combat strength versus mounted enemies. It also has a fitting trait called the Honor Code, which prevents its entire army from retreating. So if you're combining samurai with other units into one army, that army won't be able to flee if there's a samurai in it. Bear that in mind. You might want to keep them in their own army in case you want to retreat them. Their real upside is that they have good combat strength and that they don't cost any strategic resources to build. So you'll be able to build them right from the get-go once you have the technological requirement, which is also pretty easy to get. Therefore, actually, the samurai are a pretty decent unit, and I would go as far as to say maybe the Edo Japanese is only saving grace. It's a pretty easy placement here for me, and I think you can probably tell why. I'm placing the Edo Japanese at a D tier. Alrighty, so let's have a look at how this tier list finished up and conclude and make any final adjustments. So, Mughals, the only S tier, absolutely. D tier, we have the Ottomans, the Edo Japanese, and the Dutch, totally agree. This spot in the middle, I am, to be honest, slightly less certain on. I could see any of these cultures moving down one, and that being justified. Although I struggle to see many cases where I would move these up. The only one that I'm sort of second guessing is around here, the Ming. Maybe Ming could move up, and maybe the Maasai could move down. That might be the only final adjustment that I would make here, but I would note that it's a really close call. Don't forget the English are our Maasai. These ones are sort of all right around this border, I consider them to be. Other than that, though, I'm pretty happy with this. Do, as I've said throughout, let me know your feedback below. Sometimes the feedback on these tier list videos is brutal, but also really valuable. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you in the next Humankind video. Take care, everybody.